Nothing has captured the imagination of the world quite as much as the tragedy that came with the sinking of the Titanic. Today, we will examine the real story, the Titanic's last moments, what exactly happened. The Titanic was hailed as the ship of the century. It was a great ship, lovingly crafted by expert builders over many months, opulent, well-crafted, billed as unsinkable. So luxurious that the wealthy scrambled to book a place on the maiden voyage. The total cost was astronomical, $7.5 million in 1912. The length was 852.5 feet. The top speed, 23 knots, more than 26 miles an hour. The Titanic was originally designed to carry 64 lifeboats, but to save from cluttering the decks, the ship only ended up carrying 20 on her maiden voyage. Had there been more, most of the people would have survived. With a whopping 3 million rivets weighing 46,000 tons and measuring 882 feet, the distance of more than 4 city blocks, Titanic was created with labor by some 3,000 workers. Passengers walk on the deck of the Titanic in 1912, and the total length is more than 4 city blocks. Construction of the Titanic begins in 1909. Holland and Wolff make alterations to their ship lodge to accommodate the giant liners, Titanic and her sister ship Olympic. The two ships are built side by side. The captain of the Titanic is Edward John Smith, a British naval officer. He served as master of numerous White Star Line vessels. He perishes when the ship sinks on her maiden voyage. He's raised in a working-class environment, and he leaves school early to join the Merchant Navy and the Royal Naval Reserve. On the docks, on the day of the maiden voyage, people gather to say goodbye. Families saying goodbye to loved ones who were on board the Titanic. Families who never knew that they would never see their loved ones again. On that final day, everybody is excited, but that excitement will not last for long. The last photo of the captain is taken as the ship prepares to depart. Was he aware that he was going to be dead in the next few days? There are 2,240 souls on board the Titanic. Crew and passengers excitedly anticipate the maiden voyage of this majestic ship. The Titanic is provided with 14 lifeboats with a capacity for 65 persons each, or 910 persons. 2 emergency sea boats, a capacity of 35 persons each. 4 collapsible boats, a capacity for 39 persons each. Total lifeboat capacity 1,176. Total passengers on board 2,240. A shortage of 1,064. This will be significant, but right now everybody is just excited. The grand staircase on the Titanic, a thing of beauty. First class accommodation had extensive facilities, which were widely regarded as the finest of her time. There was a pool for first class passengers. First class passengers had their own deck. Here you will see a photo of the lifeboats. The Titanic featured numerous sporting and relaxation facilities, including a gym, Turkish baths, electric baths, and a steam room, a private massage room, a swimming pool, a squash court, and a barber. There was also a band. This band would later play as the Titanic sunk. First-class cabins were opulent, well-designed, and impressive, as you will see from the pictures. First-class bedrooms on the Titanic cost $3,300 each, more than a brand-new car back then. The rooms were each 50 feet long, with their own personal deck. The first-class food menu for the Titanic was very opulent. You can see a photo in the slide. First-class passengers were very well taken care of. Titanic set sail on the 20th of April 10th of April 1912. On the 11th of April 1912, the Titanic reaches Ireland. On the 14th of April 1912, Titanic hits the iceberg. On the 15th of April 1912, Carpathia reaches Titanic and rescues 705 souls. Tragedy strikes. The surviving passengers recount the tales. A number of us who were enjoying the crisp air were promenading about the deck. Captain Smith was on the bridge when the first cry from the lookout came that there was an iceberg ahead. It may have been 30 feet high when I saw it. It was possibly 200 yards away and dead ahead. Captain Smith shouted some orders. A number of us promenaders rushed to the bow of the ship. When we saw he could not fail to hit it, we rushed to the stern. Then came a crash, and the passengers were panic-stricken, says George Brayton. Deeply regret. Advise you Titanic sank this morning after collision with iceberg, resulting in serious loss of life. Full particulars later. Bruce Ismay. SOS Titanic calling. We struck ice and require immediate assistance. Water began flooding into the lower part of the ship, reaching third-class quarters first. The Titanic never discriminated. Rich and poor died together, the cold sea claiming their bodies on a voyage that was meant to be a celebration of craftsmanship. .2 of the 144 female first-class passengers were rescued, while only 32.5 of their 175 male counterparts were saved. Male second-class passengers fared the worst in terms of survival, with only 14 out of 168 making it out alive. The total survival rate for women was 74%, but for men, the survival rate was only 20%. Accommodation for third-class passengers was located in the least desirable parts of the ship, where passengers were subject to the noise and vibrations of the engines. These parts of the ship flooded within 5 to 10 minutes after the iceberg collision, and F deck flooded shortly after G deck. Third-class passengers were the majority of the deaths in the sinking because they didn't have much time to escape their staterooms. April 14, 1912, Titanic's final hour. At 10 p.m., the shift changes on the bridge, with First Officer William Murdoch relieving Second Officer Charles Lightroller as the officer of the watch. Lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee begin their watch on the Titanic's crow's nest. The night is unusually calm, making icebergs more difficult to see because there are no waves breaking at the icebergs. Adding to the difficulties is the fact that the crow's nest binoculars have been misplaced. At 11:35 p.m., the wireless operator on the Californian turns off his radio. Fleet sees an iceberg in the Titanic's path and rings the bell 3 times to indicate that something is ahead. He then calls the bridge. Murdoch orders the Titanic harder starboard to the left, and the engines are reversed. He also closes the doors to the supposedly watertight compartments. At 11:40 p.m., the starboard side of the Titanic scrapes along the iceberg. Captain Smith arrives on deck and is told that the ship has struck an iceberg. Shortly thereafter, he is informed that the mail room is filling with water. Other reports soon come in of water out of at least 5 of the ship's compartments. Designer Thomas Andrews surveys the damage. He's on board. The Titanic was built to remain afloat with only 4 compartments flooded. But now 5 of the compartments are flooded. Andrews predicts that the ship has only about 1 to 2 hours before finally sinking. SOS Titanic calling, we've struck ice and require immediate assistance. I heard a graphic account of how the Titanic upended herself and remained poised like some colossal nightmare of a fish, her tail high in the air, her nose deep in the water, until she dived finally from human sight. Except for the boats beside the ship and the icebergs, the sea was strangely empty. Hardly a bit of wreckage floated, just a deck chair or two, a few life belts, a good deal of cork, says Arthur Ostron, a survivor. Striking the water was like 1,000 knives being driven into one's body. The temperature was 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing, said Charles Lightroller. The water gushes through the damaged hull. Passengers in thin clothes were subjected to the freezing waters. Hypothermia sets in. Your heartbeat slows. You become sleepy and angry and confused. You can't think straight and have trouble walking. You can't speak. When your body temperature drops, your heart, nervous system, and other organs can't work normally. Left untreated, hypothermia can lead to complete failure of your heart and respiratory system, and eventually death. Hypothermia is caused by exposure to cold water and immersion in cold water. All of the passengers of the Titanic are exposed to hypothermia and are now at risk of death. At 12:15 a.m., Captain Smith orders Phillips and Harold Bright to send out a distress signal. Although SOS became the official distress signal several years earlier, many still use CQD. CQ signifies a general call, D is distress. Over the next several hours, Phillips sends out both. The Frankfurt is among the first to respond, but the liner is some 170 nautical miles away to the south. Other ships also offer assistance, including the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, but they are too far away. Passengers waiting to enter lifeboats are entertained by the Titanic's musicians, who initially play in the first-class lounge, but eventually move to the ship's deck. Sources will differ on how long they perform, until shortly before the ship sinks, according to some. Speculation also surrounds the last song they performed, likely either Autumn or Nearer My God to Thee. None of the musicians will survive the sinking. At 12:45 p.m., number 7 lifeboat on the starboard side is the first lifeboat lowered. It carries only 27 people, but it has room for 65. Many of the first lifeboats will be launched well below capacity, partially because the crewmen worry that the davits will be unable to hold a fully loaded lifeboat. In addition, many passengers are initially afraid to leave the ship, believing that the Titanic is unsinkable. The Titanic fires the first of 8 distressed rockets. A ship has been sighted less than 10 nautical miles away, but the crew is unable to contact it through telegraph or a Morse lamp. The rockets prove unsuccessful. Crewmen aboard the California see the rockets, but fail to determine their source. Though thought for some seen to be nearby ship seen by the Titanic, the Californian will later be believed to have been some 20 nautical miles away. The mystery ship will be thought to be a Norwegian shipping vessel that was illegally hunting seal. They do not go to help the Titanic. Those in the freezing water are now subject to hypothermia. 12:55 a.m. Lifeboat number 5 is the second lifeboat to leave the Titanic. As it's being lowered, 2 male passengers jump into the boat, injuring one of the female occupants. Lifeboat number 6 is launched, containing passenger Molly Brown and lookout fleet. The lifeboat is commanded by Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, who was at the wheel when the Titanic struck the iceberg. His subsequent actions, notably his refusal to look for survivors because they will only find stiffs, drew the ire of other occupants, notably Brown, who threatens to throw him overboard. At 1 a.m., lifeboat number 3 is lowered. It carries approximately 39 people, 12 of whom are part of the ship's crew. Water is seen at the base, E-deck of the grand staircase. Number 1 is launched with only 12 people. It can hold 40. An emergency cutter, smaller than a standard lifeboat, was designed for quick lowering, as in case of a person overboard, is number 1. Among its occupants are first-class passengers Sir Cosmo Edward Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy. 7 of the occupants are crewmen, and Duff Gordon pays each of them £5 to replace lost clothing and gear, but possibly as a bribe to keep them from letting anyone else onto the boat. At 1:10 a.m., number 8 is among the first lifeboats lowered on the port side. It's launched with only 28 people, including first-class passenger Lucy Noel Martha, Countess of Rothes, who will later man the tiller. Isidore and Ida Strauss are offered seats in the boat. However, Isidore refuses to disobey the order of women and children first. Ida will not leave her husband's side, reportedly saying, "Where you go, I go." Neither Ida or her husband will survive. At 1:20 a.m., lifeboat number 10 is launched. Among the occupants is 9-week-old Malvina Dean, who will later become the last surviving member of the disaster. She will die in 2009 at the age of 97. Lifeboat number 9 on the stern starboard side is lowered. With some 56 people on board, it's nearly full. One of the occupants is American businessman Benjamin Guggenheim's alleged mistress. Guggenheim and his valet later change into formal attire, and he reportedly says, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body will never be recovered. At 1:25 a.m., possibly not understanding the direness of the situation, the Olympic radios, "Are you steering southerly to meet us?" The Titanic responds, "We're putting the women off in the boats." While still hours away, the Olympic will be informed by the Carpathia of the Titanic's sinking. Lifeboat number 12 is lowered and about half of its seats are empty. However, it will eventually carry more than 70 people. It's 1:30 a.m. Amid the growing panic, several male passengers now try to board lifeboat number 14, causing 5th Officer Harold Lowe to fire his gun 3 times. He's later placed in command of the boat. After the sinking of the Titanic, Lowe will transfer people into lifeboats number 4, 10, 12, and collapsible D, so he can return to look for survivors in the water. He will pull several men to safety and rescue those in the partially flooded collapsible lifeboat A. The collapsible lifeboats have canvas sides that can be folded for easy storage. Their capacity is 47. Phillips continues to send out distress calls with growing desperation. Women and children in boats cannot last much longer. Number 13 is now launched and is soon followed by lifeboat number 15, which holds many third-class passengers. As it's being lowered, number 15 nearly lands on number 13, which has drifted under it. However, the crewmen in number 13 are able to cut the launch ropes and row to safety. It's now 1:35 a.m. Lifeboat number 16 is launched. It's 1:40 a.m. Collapsible C is lowered. Among its occupants is White Star chairman Bruce Ismay. Although he will later claim that no women or children were in the area when he boarded the lifeboat, others will refute that assertion. His decision not to go down with the ship will result in many branding him a coward. If you survived the sinking, you were now in the cold water, and despite a life jacket, you were now at severe risk of death. At 1:45 a.m., number 2, an emergency cutter is launched under the command of 4th Officer Boxall. Aboard are 20 people. Number 11 is lowered with 50 people aboard. Number 4 is ready for launch. Madeline Astor, some 5 months pregnant, is helped onto the boat by her husband, John Jacob Astor, the richest man on board. When Astor asks if he may join his wife, Second Officer Lightoller, who has strictly followed the order of women and children first, refuses. Astor does not press the issue and steps away. His body will later be recovered. It's now 2 a.m. The only lifeboats that remain on the Titanic are 3 of the collapsible boats. The Titanic's bow has sunk low enough that the stern's propellers are now clearly visible above the water. Crewmen lower collapsible lifeboats D from the roof of the officers' quarters. More than 20 people are in the boat. As the Titanic's bow goes under, a collapsible A is washed from the deck. Some 20 people manage to get into the boat, which is partly filled with water. By the time low-end number 14 comes to their aid, only 12 are alive. 3 bodies are left in the boat, which will be discovered a month later by the Oceanic. As crewmen try to release collapsible B, it falls, and before it can be righted, is swept off the Titanic. Some 30 men find safety on the still overturned lifeboat, including wireless operator Bride and Second Officer Lightoller. The men will later be taken aboard numbers 4 and 12. Captain Smith releases the crew, saying that it's every man for himself. Smith is reportedly last seen on the bridge. His body will never be recovered. In these photos, it's 20 minutes before Titanic sinks. At 2:17 a.m., Phillips sends a final distress signal. He reportedly makes it to the overturned collapsible lifeboat B, but succumbs to exposure. His body will not be found. At 2:18 a.m., the lights on the Titanic go out, plunging the ship into darkness. As the Titanic's bow continues to sink, the stern rises higher out of the water, placing great strain on the midsection, and the ship breaks in two between the third and fourth funnels. Reports would later speculate that it took 6 minutes for the bow section, likely traveling at approximately 30 miles an hour, to reach the ocean bottom. The stern momentarily settles back in the water before rising again, eventually becoming vertical. It briefly remains in that position before beginning its final plunge into the ocean depths. At 2:20 a.m., the stern disappears into the ocean and the Titanic is gone. There is no evidence she was ever there. The water is deathly quiet. Water pressure allegedly causes the stern, which still has air inside, to implode as it sinks. The stern lands 2,000 feet from the bow. Hundreds of people are now in the freezing water. Although there's room in most of the lifeboats, crewmen are fearful the boats will be swamped. Several boats eventually return, but it's too late. A few people are pulled to safety, but many die of exposure. Over the next several hours, numerous ships try in vain to contact the Titanic. At one point, the Burma's wireless operator, believing that he has heard the liner, sends a message: "Steaming full speed to you, shall arrive at 6 in the morning, hope you are safe." The sea is deadly quiet. Bodies are drifting in the cold ocean, many dead from the cold, some desperately clinging on to life. Mothers holding babies, men trying to find their wives and children, many die, drifting in the cold ocean. At 3:30 a.m., the Carpathia finally arrives in the area, firing rockets. They begin the search for survivors, rowing through the bodies, looking for signs of life, and in many cases, finding none. It's a strange thing when you know you're dying. It's happened to me. When it happened to me, I knew there was nothing I could do, because by the time anyone got to me, I'd be dead. There'd be no oxygen to my brain, and I didn't want to live if I was brain damaged. So I resigned myself to death. As my soul was leaving my body, I was suddenly pulled back in. The poor souls on the Titanic were not as fortunate. They slowly slipped away. Despite the tragedy on the day the ship went down, many people acted with heroism and empathy, and reading about them brings tears to my eyes. While making this video, I found myself in tears. It's these amazing people who are the very best of us, who, when tragedy strikes, sacrifice their very lives for others. When I report on events like this, they move me. I feel the pain and anguish as if I was there living the experience. And as I made this video, I was crying at the anguish and terror these poor souls must have experienced on this fateful day. May God have mercy on their souls. The ships who could have helped but never did. The temperature that day was minus 2.2 degrees Celsius. A water temperature of 32 degrees, like the ocean water on the night the Titanic sank, can lead to death in as little as 15 minutes. When the Titanic was hit hard and started sinking, it began sending out distress signals. There were 3 ships nearby before it sunk: the Samson, the Californian, and the Carpathia. Samson was 7 miles away from the Titanic. They saw the white flares signaling danger, but because the crew had been hunting seals illegally, they didn't want to be caught. They turned back and sailed away from the Titanic, condemning so many souls to die. The Californian, which was only 14 miles away from the Titanic, was surrounded by ice fields, and the captain looked up and saw the white flares. He felt the conditions weren't favorable. It was dark. He decided to go back to bed and said he would wait until morning. The crew spent time convincing themselves that nothing was wrong while people were dying in cold water. The last ship was the Carpathia. The ship was actually headed in a southerly direction, 58 miles away from the Titanic, when they heard the distress cries over the radio. The captain of the ship sensed the distress, prayed to God for direction, turned the ship around, and steamed full steam ahead through the ice fields. On the fateful night, Carpathia was the first ship to respond to distress of the mighty Titanic. It would take Carpathia approximately 3.5 hours to arrive at the position of Titanic's final distress call, a time which was only managed by Captain Arthur Rostron's valiant efforts to speed up his 9-year-old ship. The Carpathia managed 17 knots, which far surpassed her quoted top speed. While making their way to the last known coordinates of Titanic, Rostron's crew were kept busy making preparations to receive surviving passengers in order to ensure the rescue could be both successful and as swift as possible. This was the ship that saved 705 people of the Titanic. This is one of the most heroic and perilous rescue efforts. When the captain looked back at the ice fields they had come through, he said, "Someone else's hands must have been at the helm of the ship." The ship represents those people who would help people in need without worrying or waiting for the perfect conditions. Let us remember, Titanic sent the distress signal to multiple ships shortly after midnight on April 15, 1912. Only Carpathia arrived at the scene and saved 705 people. The remaining 1,517 lives got lost in the watery grave. It is said that if the other 2 ships had responded to the call, all the people on board Titanic could well have been saved. The hero of the day was Captain Arthur Henry Rostron. He became captain of the 3-year-old Carpathia in 1904. He received universal praise and celebrity as a result of his legendary efforts to rescue survivors of the Titanic, testifying in the British Board of Trade Inquiry, traveling to the United States to appear before the Senate, and receiving the Congressional Gold Medal from President William Taft. Rostron went on to command some of Cunard's most illustrious ships, including the Mauretania, the Lusitania, and in 1928 he was made Commodore of the Cunard fleet. He was named a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1919, and in 1926 he became Sir Arthur as a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire. I want you to take a few seconds to imagine the anguish, standing there watching the man you love walk away as they evacuated the women and the children, your heart torn knowing you may never see him again. Imagine the men who were left till last knowing that they were going to die in the cold ocean waters, the terror they must have felt. My heart feels their anguish, those poor souls facing their last moments. Of the first class passengers, 37% were lost. Second class, 58% were lost. Third class passengers, 74% were lost. Third class was the section to fill with water first. This section should have been the first to be evacuated. The headlines of Titanic's sinking. Had more lifeboats been installed, everyone could have been saved. No one would have had to die that day. The ship's owners, however, felt that too many lifeboats would clutter the deck and obscure the first-class passengers' view. The ship sailed under safety regulations that originated nearly 20 years earlier when the largest passenger ships weighed 10,000 tons. Titanic was more than 4 times that amount. It was this clear flouting of safety laws that caused the deaths of so many. Many died that day because ships never came to assist, because there weren't sufficient lifeboats, because the water was freezing, because there weren't proper safety protocols. Had all the ships close by heeded the call, all the souls would have survived, but they didn't. Michael and Edmund were the only 2 children to survive the sinking of the Titanic without a parent or guardian to help them along, and when they were rescued along with the rest of the survivors, no one knew what to make of them. Neither of the children spoke English, and they didn't even know their own names, so they were first dubbed Louis and Lola before the public settled on Louis and Lump. Prominent people who died on Titanic included John Jacob Astor, a millionaire who was a member of the prominent Astor family and helped build the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. He was an inventor, a science fiction novelist, and served in the Spanish-American War. Also to die, Thomas Andrews, architect of the Titanic. He traveled on the Titanic's maiden voyage in order to observe the ship and make recommendations on areas where the ship could be improved. When last seen, officers say he was seen throwing overboard deck chairs and other objects to people in the water. His chief concern was the safety of everyone but himself. John's wife, Isidore Strauss, refused to leave her husband. When her husband urged her to evacuate the ship, she responded, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." Benjamin Guggenheim, a mining magnate, died that day. He was traveling on the ship with his mistress Leontine Aubert and a number of staffers. His body was never recovered. He reportedly put a rose in his buttonhole and quipped, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." Archibald Butt, a presidential aide, also died that day. If Archie could have selected a time to die, he would have chosen the one God gave him to have said in a private memorial service, according to the Smithsonian. His life was spent in self-sacrifice serving others. Everybody who knew him called him Archie. I couldn't prepare anything in advance to say here. I tried, but I couldn't. He was too near to me. He had become as a son or a brother. The president later broke down weeping while delivering the eulogy at Butt's funeral. The messages from the survivors. I will never forget the terrible cry that rang out from people who were thrown into the sea and others who were afraid for their loved ones. It hardly bears thinking about that if there had been sufficient boats that night, every soul aboard could have been saved, since it was 2.5 hours before she struck that she tilted her massive stern into the heavens and sank by the head, taking with her all that were unprovided for. Anything of any sort can be deemed unsinkable, unbendable, unbreakable even, till the day when it sinks, breaks, and bends. Titanic is no different. Jock Hume, one of the musicians on board, was hailed as a hero for playing with the Titanic band as the ship sank. The sounds of people drowning are something that I cannot describe to you, and neither can anyone else. It's the most dreadful sound, and there's a terrible silence that follows it. I saw the first lifeboat lowered. 13 men were on board, 11 men and 2 women. Suddenly the ship seemed to shoot up out of the water and stand there perpendicularly. It seemed to us that it stood upright in the water for 4 full minutes. Then it began to slide gently downwards. Its speed increased as it went out head first, so that the stern shot down with a rush. Recovering the dead. Built to navigate in ice and fog, the Mackay Bennett braved choppy waters to reach the Titanic's last known position, arriving at the scene on Sunday the 21st of April after 4 days at sea. The crew found more bodies than they were prepared for floating among the driftwood, and spent 7 days dragging corpses on board, the hair of the dead stiff with cold and the eyelashes coated in frost. Tracy Ooster, forensic anthropologist, says they would have seen frozen and frostbitten bodies. They probably wouldn't have looked in bad condition on the surface, but once they started pulling bodies out of the water, they would have noticed that the submerged lower portion was far more decomposed. Most probably didn't drown. They would have frozen to death. The bodies were hauled from the sea and laid out on the deck, where they were numbered and their physical characteristics and records were noted. On the night that Titanic sank in April 1912, the water temperature was estimated at 1/2 to 2 degrees below 0 degrees Celsius, and the victims were in the water for 2 hours. People immersed in water that cold are only expected to survive for about 45 minutes, and almost nobody in the water survived long enough to be rescued. Even many of those in the waterlogged lifeboats, often in clothes that were soaked through, succumbed to the cold. More than 1,500 people perished in the disaster, and well over 1,000 of them were never found, many likely trapped in the ship as it went down. The bodies that stayed on the ocean surface floated there for another 6 days after the sinking, until the Mackay Bennett, the first of 4 recovery ships, arrived to begin retrieving them from the sea. Upon reaching the site, the crew members described the debris field as a flock of seagulls in the fog, because of the white life vests that many of the bodies wore. Although partially preserved by the cold, the bodies were bleached by the sun and otherwise damaged, both from the sinking as well as from knocking against each other and the wreckage of the ship. Over time, the bodies had drifted from the site of the sinking and had spread out across a wide expanse of sea. The frigid ocean water was a key material element that shaped both the Titanic disaster and the recovery. As they searched for and retrieved victims' bodies, the workers were intensely aware of the perils of freezing water through their contact with the bodies and the water itself. During the Mackay Bennett recovery, the crew worked under arduous conditions on rowboats enveloped in dense fog, surrounded by lurching waves and intermittent icebergs of the kind that sank the much larger Titanic. In calmer seas, they were able to pile 7 or 8 bodies at a time in each of the ship's boats. Throughout, the clothes of the recovery workers became saturated with sea water, leaving them thoroughly soggy and cold. The 4 recovery ships together would account for 337 bodies. The Mackay Bennett's body retrieval process alone took 5 days, not counting the total of 8 days spent traveling to and from the site, including a return journey on a ship loaded down with the dead. During the recovery, once it became clear that the Mackay Bennett could not preserve all of the bodies long enough to take them to shore, roughly 1/3 of the bodies were buried at sea. Another one of the tragedies of this terrible disaster was families denied life insurance payouts. Families who lost providers were further tortured, not only by the loss of their loved ones, but again because the bodies were thrown into the sea by the rescuers, there was no evidence of death to claim on life insurance. The families suffered financially and emotionally. After the first day of the week-long rescue mission, 51 bodies had been recovered, many too mangled or rotten to be identifiable if it wasn't for their belongings, which were meticulously logged and stored in numbered bags. But soon the crew realized they had a problem. They were running out of coffins. Before he set off, Captain Lander had agreed a system to follow in case tough choices had to be made. Bodies of first-class passengers identifiable by fancy clothes and expensive possessions would be prioritized and given valuable coffin space. The remains of second-class passengers were stored in canvas sacks, while passengers identified as third class would be buried at sea. By the time the Mackay Bennett was at full capacity, the ship was carrying 190 bodies, just over 10% of the Titanic dead, but 116 had been cast into the depths. Of all the poor passengers who were left to rot beneath the waves, wrapped in cloth and weighed down so they would sink to the bottom, only 56 of these were ever identified. The cruelty of this disaster is most evident with the bodies. Indeed, some of them appeared battered, bruised, and cut up from the event of the sinking. They were frozen in the treacherously cold North Atlantic at night, and were bleached by the sunlight during the day. As if an amusement for a cruel sea, they bobbed, had their faces repeatedly dunked in the water, and became wrinkled and discolored as they decomposed. These were people, with hopes, ideals, struggles. Each had an important story to tell. Brothers, sisters, parents, and children had loved them. Most of them had families and careers. Later in Halifax, photographs were taken of them. As we shall see, the images of the bodies may be the starkest, most unalterable, and truthful testimony to the ravages wrought by the Titanic's foundering. Most of the bodies were thrown into the sea, never to be seen again, the families never having closure about what happened to their loved ones. The elements destroyed the bodies and made identification difficult. Even in death, the not-so-wealthy were discriminated against, denied respect and proper cremation, denied even financial compensation to the families of the dead. The British owners of the Titanic successfully petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court in 1914 to be allowed to pursue limitation of liability in the American court system. Many of the factors leading to the loss of life on board the ship were judged to have been unforeseeable. Hundreds of claimants had joined the suit, asking for more than $16 million in damages, but in the end, the company paid a total settlement of only $664,000, which needed to be divided among all the surviving passengers. What can we learn from the Titanic disaster? Outdated standards and requirements. The Titanic was only supplied with enough lifeboats and jackets for half its passengers. There were no safety regulations in place for a ship of the size. Lack of training. The 20 lifeboats were not used to full capacity. At least 4 lifeboats were filled at 50% capacity or less. One lifeboat that could carry 40 people only had 12 passengers. The lifeboat drill that was scheduled to take place the day of the Titanic hit the iceberg was cancelled by Captain Edward Smith. There is speculation that the training could have impacted the outcome of the emergency escape, potentially saving more lives. Adequate tools and protection. The ship was short in safety equipment. Some of the officers on the bridge didn't have binoculars or searchlights. This fact, among many others, may have contributed to the officers only having 30 seconds to react before they hit the iceberg. Each minute gained potentially could have saved hundreds more lives. Emergency backup. There was another ship, the Californian, within 30 miles of the Titanic, and its crew saw flares and intercepted emergency response requests. During investigations after the Titanic sinking, a U.S. Senate subcommittee and the British Board of Trade both concluded that the Californian could have rescued some of the 700 people left floating in the water for 3 hours before Carpathia made it to that location to rescue the remaining survivors. The sinking of the Titanic is something that deeply moves me, and deeply moved me while making this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. The thought of these poor souls makes me sad, and as I mentioned, during the making of this video, I cried for all those who died that day. I felt anger at the boats that never went to help, and felt the anguish of the women who watched their husbands walk away, knowing they would never see them again. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let us never forget incidents like Titanic. Let us learn from them to prevent things like this happening going forward. If you enjoyed my video, please like, comment, and subscribe.